The crowd at the Prescott auction yard didn't whisper. They spoke loud enough to brand her soul. "She can't bear children," one man muttered as he spat in the dust. And her mother didn't flinch. She only tugged Clara forward by the wrist, shouting her price like someone selling a broken horse. The sun hammered the boards, the air thick with heat and shame. Clara Hale, 23, kept her eyes on the ground, because looking up meant seeing faces that would never forget. Her mother's voice cracked, but not from sorrow, only from effort. "She's strong, obedient, quiet. You won't find better for housework or field." The word Barren slid through the murmurs like a knife. A few men laughed. One lifted his hat to wipe sweat and said he might pay less since she was half a woman. Before Clara could breathe, another voice cut through, calm, low, and steady. "Full price." Every head turned to a tall rancher standing beside a gray mare, coat dusty from the trail, eyes unreadable beneath his hat brim. He didn't haggle, didn't look at Clara as property. He handed over a folded note and waited while her mother counted each bill like she was gutting time itself. Then, with business complete, the woman who'd given Clara life turned away without even blessing her name. For a moment, the world stilled. Only the creak of wagon wheels somewhere down the street and a baby crying in the distance. The rancher, Elias Ward, stepped forward, took the frayed rope from her wrist, and dropped it in the dirt. "You can ride," he said quietly, nodding toward his wagon. No command, no reach for her arm. Just a simple mercy that felt foreign on her skin. She hesitated, uncertain if it was a trick. Then climbed onto the back where sacks of feed shifted with the motion. As the wagon rolled away, the town blurred into sun glare and dust. She clutched her skirt, half waiting for the world to mock again, but all she heard was the soft creak of wheels and the rhythm of hooves. Elias never looked back at her mother. He just rode steady, like a man hauling silence instead of grain. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking his ranch, the wind had cooled, carrying the scent of mesquite and rain. Clara stared at the wide plain below. Fences mended, fields turned, a house that stood like a promise no one had dared make. For the first time in years, she felt something uncoiling inside her that wasn't fear. Not hope exactly, but the beginning of it. When they reached the ranch, Elias Ward didn't lead her to a parlor or porch like a new bride. He dismounted, unhitched the mare, and said only, "There's stew on the stove. Eat before it cools." Then he walked to the corral, his shoulders carrying the stillness of a man who'd forgotten how to speak more than necessary. Clara followed him with her eyes, uncertain if he expected obedience or rest, until she noticed the house door standing open. Inside, the scent of smoke and sage hung in the air. The table was set for one. On a nearby peg hung another hat, a woman's, worn and dust-faded. The sight made her throat tighten. She moved quietly, her every step listening for permission that never came. The stew was thick and cold, but she ate it anyway because hunger had its own dignity. Later, when Elias came back, the sunset cut sharp lines through the window, painting the room in bands of amber. He wiped his hands on a rag, then spoke without looking at her. "You'll sleep in the back room. Clean, cook, and keep the animals fed. You're not expected to be anything else." It wasn't cruelty in his tone, just a wall built so high she couldn't see its top. She nodded, unsure what to answer. When he walked past, she noticed a scar that ran from his temple down to his jaw, like a story no one had permission to tell. That night, she lay on a narrow bed beside a window facing the open field. The land looked endless, lonely but honest. In the corner of the yard, near the well, something caught her eye. A patch of earth turned dry and gray, a single seedling wilting where the soil cracked. It leaned toward her window like it had been waiting for someone to notice. The next morning she carried a bucket, filled it from the well, and poured gently around the plant. Elias saw her from the barn. He didn't stop her, just watched with that unreadable stillness until she finally asked, "What was planted here?" He paused, gripping the fence rail. Something that didn't take. She almost said like me, but bit the words back. Still, she watered it again the next day, and again the one after that. She didn't know why. Maybe because the plant looked as out of place as she felt. Something dismissed, yet still reaching for light. By the third morning, the silence between them had become a kind of language. Elias spoke in gestures. A nod toward the woodpile meant he needed it stacked. A glance at the stove meant he was hungry. Clara moved through the house like a ghost who remembered manners. The rooms were clean, but hollow. The walls hung with dust and restraint. While sweeping the corner of the sitting room, she found a small trunk half hidden beneath a quilt. Curiosity wasn't allowed in her mother's house, but something about the locked silence here begged to be broken. She lifted the lid and froze. Inside lay a faded photograph of a woman holding a baby, both faces pale from the sun's bleach but still alive with warmth. The woman's hair was pinned loose, her smile soft and certain. Clara's breath caught as she brushed the dust away. Behind the photo lay a child's knitted sock, yellowed with age. Before she could tuck it back, the floorboard creaked. Elias stood in the doorway. His eyes darkened when he saw what she held. "Don't touch that," he said, voice quiet but edged with something raw. Clara stammered, I was only cleaning. Then clean somewhere else." He crossed the room, took the photograph, and returned it to the trunk as though it might shatter if the air touched it too long. The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was haunted. She backed away, heart hammering, more frightened of the sadness in his tone than his anger. That night she couldn't sleep. The moonlight traced thin silver lines across the floor, landing on her hands, hands that had held someone else's grief for a breath too long. She tried to convince herself it didn't matter. That whatever wound he carried had nothing to do with her. Yet when she went outside to pour water for the horses, she caught Elias near the fence, staring toward the empty field where the seedling grew. His posture sagged, one hand gripping the post like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Something in that stillness whispered the truth before words could. She wasn't the only one branded by loss. The next morning, when she saw him leave early for town, she slipped a small scrap of cloth near the seedling to keep it shaded. "You're not done yet," she murmured. The words were meant for the plant, but the ache behind them was for both of them. The next day began with the smell of coffee and thunder. Elias was already outside mending the fence when a sound broke through the stillness. A soft shuffle, the hesitant steps of someone too small to belong. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out to see a boy, no older than 9, standing by the gate with a torn shirt and a nervous gaze. His hair stuck to his forehead, his cheeks sunburnt. Elias froze mid-stride, the hammer still in his hand. "You lost?" he asked. The boy shook his head. "Hungry." "Just that. Hungry." Elias hesitated before motioning him inside. "Wash up," he said quietly, then to Clara, "There's bread." The boy introduced himself as Ben, voice barely a whisper. When he reached for the cup of milk Clara handed him, she noticed his fingers trembling. On a chain around his neck hung a small locket. Dented and silver, its hinge cracked. When she wiped the dirt from it, she saw faint letters engraved. E.W. She looked up sharply, Elias's initials. He saw her notice but said nothing, his face turned toward the window. The silence between them tightened. After Ben ate, Elias asked where he came from. The boy mumbled about a neighbor who took him in after his ma got sick. Clara watched Elias's jaw set, that familiar grief flickering across his eyes like lightning behind cloud. He told the boy he could rest in the barn for the night, and when Ben had gone, Clara dared to ask, "You know him?" Elias's answer came too quick. "No." But his voice cracked on the word, and she heard the lie. Later, when she took a lantern out to check on Ben, he was curled beneath a saddle blanket, clutching the locket like a heartbeat. The same carved initials glimmered again in the lamplight, undeniable. Clara returned to the house and found Elias standing by the cold stove, hands braced on the counter, breathing like a man fighting ghosts. "You shouldn't have brought him here," he said quietly, though she hadn't. "He came on his own," she replied, her voice shaking with something that wasn't fear this time, something closer to knowing. He looked at her then. Really looked. The first time since the auction. Whatever he'd buried deep inside seemed to waver at the edges. Outside, thunder rolled, and somewhere in the dark, the seedling trembled under the first drops of rain. 2 days later, Elias hitched the wagon for supplies and told Clara she could ride along if she needed cloth or soap. She hesitated, but agreed, partly out of necessity, partly to escape the house where silence now felt heavier than heat. The road into town shimmered with dust and the scent of coming rain. At the general store, eyes turned the moment they entered. Clara felt the familiar sting of murmurs. "That's the one," a woman whispered near the sugar barrels. "The Barren bride he bought off her own mother." Laughter rippled, low and mean. Clara kept her head down, gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles whitened. The storekeeper, an old woman named Mavis, stepped closer and whispered under her breath, "Don't mind them, child. The world's cruelest mouths are usually the hungriest." Then, as she handed over the folded fabric, her tone softened further. "He's not a bad man, that rancher. Lost more than a wife that night, they say." Clara froze. "What night?" Mavis only shook her head. "Ask him if you're brave enough." On the wagon ride home, Elias said nothing. His jaw was locked, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Clara wanted to speak, to ask about the rumor, but the words tangled. Instead, she studied his hands. Rough, scarred, steady. Not a cruel man's hands, but ones that had held too much and let go too late. When the ranch came into view, the seedling by the well stood taller, its first green leaf uncurling toward the light. Elias noticed it too, his gaze lingering before he walked past. "You've been tending it," he said quietly. "It wanted to live," she answered. His reply came after a long pause. "Some things God doesn't let you fix." Then he went inside, leaving the screen door to slam behind him. That night, Clara couldn't eat. She thought of the photograph, of Ben's locket, of Mavis's cryptic kindness. All the threads led back to the same wound Elias refused to name. When the wind picked up and rattled the shutters, she stepped outside. The moonlight fell over the field, silvering the sprout's small leaves. She knelt beside it, pressing her palms into the soil. "You'll grow," she whispered, "even if no one believes it." Behind her, from the house, a single lamp flickered out. Elias's light gone dark for the night. But his shadow lingered on the porch rail, watching without words. By the time the storm came, the air was already trembling with warnings, the sky bruised purple and gray, the wind turning sharp enough to peel the dust from the earth. Elias had gone to secure the barn doors, shouting through the rain for her to stay inside, But Clara stood at the window, eyes fixed on the small patch of soil near the well where the seedling swayed wildly in the wind. It bent once, twice, then disappeared behind the curtain of downpour. Panic rose in her chest before she could stop it. She threw her shawl over her shoulders and ran out into the storm, barefoot, the mud swallowing her steps. Lightning split the sky as she knelt by the fragile plant, cupping it with her hands, water streaming down her arms. The wind ripped at her hair, tore the shawl from her shoulders. But she refused to move until she dug the small root free and cradled it in her palms. "Not again," she whispered, not even sure who she was begging. When she stumbled back into the house, drenched and shaking, Elias stood at the door, thunder behind him, disbelief in his eyes. "Are you mad?" he shouted, grabbing a towel and wrapping it around her shoulders. "You could have been struck down out there." But when she opened her hands to show the small, trembling sprout, his voice faltered. She placed it in a tin cup and set it near the hearth, beside the drying wood. For a long moment neither spoke. Then he reached out, fingers hovering above the little green leaf. "You saved it," he murmured, half to himself. "It matters," she said softly. "Even the smallest thing deserves a chance." Something broke in his face, some wall she hadn't known she'd been pressing against. Later, when the thunder rolled into distance, Elias sat by the fire, staring into the flames like they were old memories come to visit. He spoke without looking at her. "Once, I thought I could keep something alive just by loving it enough," he said, voice unsteady. "Turns out love's not enough when the sky decides otherwise." Clara didn't answer, only moved the little cup closer to the warmth. The plant trembled in the flickering light, tiny, defiant, and alive. For the first time since she'd arrived, Elias didn't walk away. He sat there beside her, watching it, his silence no longer a wall but a wound finally beginning to breathe. The air turned soft after the storm, heavy with the scent of wet earth and mesquite. The seedling stood alive again, its stem bending toward the sun through the window where Clara had set it. Elias had ridden into town at dawn to return borrowed tools, leaving her alone with chores and questions that had grown restless overnight. While sweeping the hallway, her broom struck something loose beneath the cabinet, a folded scrap of parchment sealed with wax so brittle it crumbled at her touch. Curiosity pried it open before guilt could stop her. The handwriting was Elias's, but the letter wasn't meant for her eyes. It was dated 6 years earlier, addressed to a name she'd seen only once, in the photograph. "If this reaches whoever tends the child," it read, "tell him his father is alive but cannot come. The woman I loved is buried here under the white oak, and I cannot forgive myself for what my hands failed to save." Clara's pulse quickened. She read the lines again, slower this time, as though the paper itself trembled. A second page was folded behind it, a reply written in another hand, shaky and small. "The boy lives with neighbors. He is told his father died. Let it stay so." The signature was a name she already knew. Mavis, the same Mavis who'd spoken to her in town. Clara pressed the letter to her chest, dizzy. Everything fit, the photograph, the locket, the ache behind Elias's silence. The boy sleeping in the barn was his son. She sat down hard on the floor, heart caught between pity and fury. Why hide something so sacred? When Elias returned that evening, his clothes smelled of horses and rain. She hid the letter quickly beneath the floorboard, forcing her breath steady. He asked if everything was all right. She lied with a nod. Over supper, his eyes kept flicking to the seedling glowing by lamplight. "You kept it alive," he said, voice roughened by wonder and fear. Sometimes it's not the soil that's wrong, she whispered. It's the weather. He looked up sharply, but she didn't explain. Later, when he went to the barn to check on Ben, she leaned against the doorway, the hidden letter burning like a secret in her apron pocket. Outside, the night hummed with crickets. The plant's leaves shimmered in the lamplight, green and defiant. She knew then that truth had its own roots. It could hide for a while, but eventually, it reached for daylight. The next morning began too quiet, the kind of stillness that carried warning. Clara rose early to fetch water, but before she reached the well, she saw Ben limping up the ridge, shirt torn, cheek bruised purple. He was crying without sound, trying to hide it. Elias dropped his tools and ran, catching the boy by the shoulders. "Who did this?" His voice came out raw, unfiltered. "Mr. Danner," Ben stammered. "Said I was lazy. Said I didn't belong." Clara felt her heart slam. Danner, the neighbor who'd taken him in. Elias's face turned white, a fury so deep it trembled his hands. "You do belong," he said, pulling the boy close. That single word, belong, shook something in Clara. She knew this was the moment. She went inside, grabbed the hidden letter, and stepped back onto the porch. "Elias," she said, her voice breaking. "You can't lie anymore." He turned, eyes narrowing in confusion that turned quickly to realization. She held out the letter, the wax seal broken. "I found this. I know the truth. Ben's not some orphan. He's your son." Silence struck harder than thunder. Ben looked between them, unsure. Elias took the paper with trembling hands, scanning the words that he'd once written and buried like a sin. His face seemed to age 10 years in a breath. "You weren't supposed to see that," he whispered. "No one was." "He deserves to know who he is," Clara said softly. "You both do." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind pushing through the open doorway. Then Elias sank to his knees beside the boy, his voice unsteady. "Your mother was good, Ben. I was the fool who let her die believing I could protect them both." The boy touched his father's arm. A gesture so small it seemed to crack the air open. Clara watched the walls fall from Elias's face, the shame, the guilt, the silence all spilling out into daylight. He pulled Ben into his arms, and the sound that escaped him wasn't grief exactly. It was something older, like a prayer finally being answered. When he looked at Clara again, there were tears, yes, but also something steadier. Acceptance. "You weren't meant to find me," he said. "None of this was meant." She shook her head. Maybe mercy doesn't ask permission. Behind them, the seedling by the window caught the light, 2 new leaves unfurling toward the dawn. Elias didn't speak much the next morning, but his silence had changed shape. It wasn't the old kind, the kind that built walls. It was one filled with decision. Before dawn had fully lifted, he saddled the horses and said, "I'm going to bring my son home proper." His tone carried no thunder, just resolve. Clara insisted on going with them. She'd seen enough of how men like Danner treated the weak. Ben rode between them, clutching the locket that once marked him nameless. Now, he held it like proof. When they reached town, the same people who'd whispered about Clara's shame stepped aside to stare. Mavis, the shopkeeper, stood on her porch, eyes soft but knowing. Danner emerged from the livery, sneering when he saw Elias. "Come to fetch your charity case?" he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Elias dismounted slowly. "My son," he corrected. The word landed heavy, echoing off the storefront glass. Danner laughed. "You've got no paper, no proof." But before Elias could answer, Clara stepped forward, voice steady. "I have proof enough." She drew the letter from her apron, the one she'd carried folded close to her heart since the night before. Mavis crossed the street, confirming what she'd written years ago, that the child had been left with neighbors until Elias could face himself again. The crowd gathered, hungry for spectacle, but they didn't get a fight. They got a reckoning. Elias read the letter aloud, his voice breaking only once at the line about forgiveness. When he finished, the silence was absolute. Danner muttered curses but saw no allies among the faces watching. "The law can keep your boy," he said weakly, "but it can't make him love you." Elias met his gaze. "That's what you never understood. Love doesn't take orders." He turned away, helping Ben onto the wagon beside Clara. As they started home, a few women lowered their eyes in shame, women who'd once laughed at the Barren bride. Clara looked straight ahead, spine straight as the road stretching east. She'd left this town in chains. Now she was leaving as witness to a man's redemption and her own. When they passed the ridge, the wind carried the scent of coming rain again. Ben leaned against his father, exhausted, safe. Elias reached for Clara's hand on the reins and held it quietly. No words between them. Just the weight of everything finally returned to where it belonged. Weeks passed, and the valley softened beneath autumn light. The fields around Elias's ranch breathed again. The air carried a sweetness of hay and river wind. Ben's laughter, once cautious, now echoed across the yard as he chased a stray chicken toward the fence. Clara stood near the porch, apron dusted with flour, eyes following the sound like it was the first song she'd ever learned. Elias came from the barn, sleeves rolled, sawdust in his beard, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. Two people once broken in different ways, now bound by something gentler than fate. Near the well, the seedling had grown taller than her knee, leaves glistening like green glass in the sun. She knelt beside it, brushing the soil. "You almost didn't make it," she whispered. "But you did." Elias joined her, crouching close. "Guess it only needed the right hands." He hesitated, then added, "Like me." She met his gaze, surprised by the softness there. "You didn't need saving, Elias," she said. "You just needed someone to remind you you're still alive." He smiled faintly, the kind that came from deep scars finally learning peace. "And you?" he asked. "What did you need?" Her eyes fell to the earth. "To be seen as more than what I can't give." He reached out then, not to claim her, but to touch the sprout's stem between them. "Then let this be proof," he said. "We weren't barren, Clara, just waiting for rain." The words folded over her like sunlight. Ben ran up, breathless, holding the silver locket open. Inside, he'd placed a pressed wildflower. "It's for Ma," he said shyly. "And for you." She took it, fingers trembling. Realizing that the boy's innocence had done what grief could not. It had made them whole. Later that evening, as the sun melted behind the ridges, Elias lit a small lantern and placed it by the seedling. The light flickered gold over the leaves, a living promise that loss could bloom if given patience. Clara leaned against the porch rail, her heart no longer a hollow thing. The ranch that once felt like exile had become sanctuary. When Elias turned to her, the distance that had ruled their first days was gone. "Some things," he said quietly, "don't need to be spoken." She nodded, smiling through the dusk. "And some things," she replied, "finally can be." Behind them, the seedling shimmered in the lamplight, alive, unafraid, and blooming exactly where it had once been written off as dead. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen her there, would you have stepped in too? Tell us in the comments.